room. We'll get all our paperwork together, and then we'll bring you back in the courtroom for further instruction.
And with that, James Addie was found guilty of all charges. All right, I want to bring in a couple of guests for our debrief today. From Austin, Texas, trial attorney Holly Davis, she joins us, and investigative reporter with ABC 17 News in Missouri, Lucas Geisler, also joins us. Thank you so much for being with me, guys.
Thank you, Michael.
Happy to be here.
All right, Holly, let me start with you. Just let me get your reaction to the verdict.
I think that it was a couple of days coming. I feel like the evidence was overwhelming. I thought the closing statements were excellent from the prosecution. I feel like the level of mastery that the prosecutors had on this case and their relations to the jury and their arguments were very persuasive. And I found that the defense's theory of the case overall was confusing and ultimately did not carry the day. And I realize now that this is, Monday morning quarterbacking on this trial, but I think there were a couple of opportunities the defense had in this case that were passed up on that might have made a little bit more sense to a jury that's just looking for an answer as to why the overwhelming evidence presented by the prosecution is not to be believed.
Yeah, I mean, you said his theory was confusing. In a little while, I'd love for you to tell me what his theory was, because I didn't see one. Lucas, let me ask you, 2 hours and 32 minutes. It was pretty assured that if you come back that quickly, it was going to be a guilty verdict.
In many of the murder cases that I've covered around here, Michael, usually these verdicts or these deliberations take anywhere from 4 to 5 hours long. So about a 2.5-hour deliberation is pretty quick, especially for a first-degree murder case. I do think a big part of the case, especially in those closing arguments that Monroe County Prosecutor Tally Smith laid out there in the beginning, really just laid it out very clearly. The sort of long stretch of lies that James Addie had put together had sort of created this years-long relationship with Molly Watson without his wife and daughter who took the stand for the state, without their knowledge, I think laid out a very, very clear motive for them, something easy for the jury to understand when they went back to deliberate, because essentially it boiled down to, and when it has been brought up with the defense coming in there and trying to refute some of that, it never really seemed like there was anyone else in the picture. Who else could this have been that did this? So I think the state made it a very, very clear laying out the evidence and also very clearly establishing a motive too.
Yeah, they had a very clear story, and I'll tell you what, after their closing, if you didn't like James Addie to begin with, you certainly didn't like him after that, which made it much easier to come back with a guilty verdict. All right, now let's move along now. As soon as the jury rendered their verdict, guys, the court turned to the sentencing phase. The first-degree murder charge carried a mandatory life sentence without parole. Now, even so, criminal procedure in Missouri required the jury to sentence Addie on the lesser charge of armed criminal action. They could recommend as much time as they wanted for that charge, with the minimum being 3 years in prison. In essence, it was a chance for the jury to send a message about what they thought of Addie's actions. Well, that jury made it clear how they felt, recommending 7 times the minimum. They recommended 20 years in prison. The judge will now have to decide whether to adopt their recommendation. Now, he cannot sentence him to more than the 20 that they recommended, but he could decide to sentence him to less, and sentencing has been set for June 29th. Now, the sentencing phase in this case today may have been symbolic in a way, but it was powerful. Before going back to deliberate on the sentence, the jury got to listen to victim impact statements. Take a listen to Molly Watson's brother. He stood up before James Addie and the court to give his victim impact statement. Listen.
I just want to say Molly was my best friend and sister that I will never see again. This monster took her from not only I, but all the family and friends that love her. This horrible tragedy caused my mom to go over the edge before she passed away this year. She was diagnosed with severe psychological trauma from Molly's murder. My dad had been taking care of my mom for over 2 years, dealing with the stress of a murdered daughter and a wife of 50 years that sometimes couldn't recognize him. The stress from that took his life in September of 2020 of a heart attack. The heartache and stress of it all has taken a toll on all of us. Molly had the world in front of her. She was taken from us way too soon. I truly believe if he had have chose to break up with her instead of murder her, I would still have my sister, my mom, and my dad with me.
Now, Holly, that clearly is a devastating question, right? The idea that why didn't he just break up with Molly? Why did he have to kill her? And listening to these victim impact statements, we also heard a letter read into evidence from her son. Now, this jury didn't get to know a lot about her, but, right, they actually heard about all of this about Molly from the brother and the son, and it was incredibly impactful.
You're absolutely right, Michael. It was heavy. It was a heavy moment in the courtroom. I want to go back to your excellent first question is how could this happen? Why didn't he just break up with her? We have to get into the mind of a person who's carrying out an affair for 7 years and not just carrying out an affair, but living a double life. It's one thing to have a girlfriend on the side, and that's not acceptable socially, but it is more prevalent. It's another thing to actually pursue an engagement and a marriage to the person that you're having an affair with while simultaneously living with the other person. In order to do that, you have to always think you're going to get away with it. You are constantly checking in on the psychology of both your wife and your girlfriend to see how you can manipulate the situation to make one person believe you or not. So we're dealing with a person who believes that they can most of the time get away with it because for decades and years this person has. Do I think this is a well thought out plan? No, I don't. I imagine that Molly started to ask too many confusing questions about the alleged death of his wife when she wasn't able to find any obituary online. So things started to not add up. And when things don't add up for the perfectly planned, person living a double life, panic ensues. And so I think in order to, wonder why he wasn't able to break up with her, you have to also think that I think Jim Addie thought that if he did that, he'd lose both women. And this was a person who was living a very selfish life. If he were to tell his girlfriend or his fiance, she would likely tell his wife, and he'd probably lose both. His short-sighted thinking might have been something along the lines of, I'm trying to keep one of them because I can't keep both in this moment. And while it's very difficult for us to understand, I imagine that's what he was thinking. And you have to have been completely cold-blooded not to have been choked up in hearing her son's written testimony. I was watching, I was listening, I got choked up, and I'm able to have cold blood in the courtroom, but even I was touched by that, and I believe the prosecutor was as well. I noticed her voice cracked at a certain particular moment.
Actually,
and this is
I'm glad you mentioned the son because actually I want to play a little bit of that letter. Now, he didn't speak himself, but a letter that he had written to the court was read into evidence. Let's listen.
You are the kind of man who is a coward, who has no regrets about his past actions, and you are willing to move on to the next person like they are just an object. And my mother was no object. She was more important to me than you can ever imagine, and I was more important to her than you ever were. So in a way, you took something from both of us. You took away my mom from me. You took away her son from her. Here's the bottom line. You now have to face the consequences of your actions. And I hope you now have to face them